Welcome to Valuation, another national episode in Tom's Next Level Exam Prep Series. Yes, I'm Tom, and I designed this series to help you pass your real estate exams, just like I've helped hundreds of my previous students. I also urge you to watch my Welcome and my Exam Insights and Strategies videos for a complete overview of this series. You'll learn how to get the most benefit from these topical videos. Here's just a quick recap from some of the important points in my welcome video. These videos focus on testable information. Clearly, we're just a supplement to your education provider's materials. I don't try and reteach the information, but we're going to focus on the highly testable concepts. I also encourage you to please take a lot of notes. The more notes you take, the more things you'll remember for your exam. So please take notes as you go through these videos. Let's get started on valuation. Gather your course materials from your education provider, grab your notebook, keep that positive attitude in place, and let's get started going through this topic. I point out in my Exam Insights and Strategies video that all of your test questions are going to be multiple choice questions, typically with 4 choices. Many of them will be except questions. All of the following are true of appraisals except. So review the information that way. I'm going to approach it that way as I go through this material with you. Appraisers and appraisals. What things are true of an appraisal? Well, it's somebody's opinion of value. It's not a fact. It's just an opinion of value. Appraisals are required on all federally related loans. Any loan that goes through FHA, VA, other loans that are federally related require an appraisal. Most appraisals follow detailed state requirements. And there's also some organizations that deal with appraisers, and one of them is USPAP. Okay, you'll have to know that acronym for appraisals. So I wanted to drill down on 2 more very important points. The difference between market value and market price. Notice that market value is an estimate of the value of the property. We don't know what it's going to really sell for, because once it sells, that establishes a market price. So an appraiser might appraise a property at $300,000. That's the market value, because that's the appraiser's opinion. But when it finally sells at $290,000 or $310,000, that establishes an actual market price. So remember this for the test. Market value is an estimate and an opinion, but a market price is a hard, cold fact that you can look up. You know from your education provider's materials that there's 4 characteristics of value. Acronym to remember them is DUST: demand, utility, scarcity, and transferability. But how are they going to ask you those on the test? There'll be a question like, all of the following are one of the characteristics of value, except. So there'll be 3 of these, and then 1 dopey choice that will clearly not be one of these 4. That'll be the correct answer to an except question. Or they might give you an example. Something like, if there's a lot of people in an area who really want one property, which characteristic of value is in play? Well, that would be demand. Or if a property has a lot of clouds on the title, which characteristic might be impacted? That would be transferability. So just be aware they can ask these questions in a couple of different directions. Notice now we're going to switch gears and talk about principles of value. Now, please make a note in your book to remember the difference between a characteristic of value and a principle of value. You'll need to know that distinction for the test. Remember, characteristics of value, there were only 4, and the acronym to remember them was DUST. Now, they may ask you on the test, all of the following are one of the principles of value, except, and they'll throw in the answers one of the characteristics of value. Well, it's not a principle, it's a characteristic. I know, but welcome to Test World. This is why I go through this with you, to make sure you look at the key points and remember how to answer these questions and how to analyze the questions. The principle of change says no condition remains the same. Properties in neighborhoods and cities are always in a changing cycle. They will ask you a question about the principle of contribution. Okay? The principle of contribution says the value of any part of a property is measured by its effect on the entire value. What the heck does that mean? Here's a question they'll ask you on the test, very likely. Tom owns a house and he improved his kitchen. He did a total kitchen remodel. Spent $40,000 on a totally upgraded, nice kitchen remodel for his home. How much did that impact the total value of the house? $40,000? We don't know until there's an appraisal done. Just because I spent $40,000 to improve my kitchen doesn't mean that the entire value of my house went up $40,000. The one example you might see on the test would be a swimming pool. If you have a home in Minnesota with a swimming pool that you spent $40,000 on, it will impact the property value, but not necessarily as much as it would if that same home was in California and you spent $40,000 on a swimming pool, because it's used more often. There's just more of a contribution to the overall value. In fact, some people I've talked to in Minnesota say they had a home with a pool and some buyers wanted to buy the house, but they said, we don't want any part of a pool. We can only use it for 3 months. They're expensive. So they told the sellers, if you take the pool out or fill it in, then we'll pay you what you want for the house. So in that situation, the principle of contribution said the pool deducted from the value of the house. So just be aware of that type of conversation may come up in a test question. The other one is the principle of substitution. Remember this for the test. The principle of substitution is the most important principle in appraisal and valuation. I'm pretty sure you'll see that as a test question. It's often there. Which of the following principles is the most important in valuation of properties? The correct answer is going to be the principle of substitution. Here is 4 more principles of value that are highly testable. Principle of competition, that basically is supply and demand. The higher the supply, typically the lower the price, but the higher the demand, the higher the price. So when you study the relationship between value and supply and demand. High supply usually means lower price. High demand can mean higher price. Principle of conformity. That simply states that is the property we're trying to value in harmony with its surroundings? Is it of equal or similar to value to other homes in the neighborhood? That ties into the next 2 principles of progression and regression. So I want you to be aware of those 2 terms and principles and how they'll show up on the test. The principle of progression says if I have a $100,000 house in an area of $300,000 homes, what does that do to the value of my $100,000 house? My $100,000 home is going to go up, given the principle of progression, because my house went up in value. It works the opposite with the principle of regression. What if I have a $300,000 house in a neighborhood of $100,000 homes? How will that impact my value? Pretty common sense. It'll bring my values down. But what's the principle of value that applies there? For the test, you need to know that's the principle of regression. If my values go down, principle of regression. Let's start and go through the 3 different approaches to value. The first one is the sales approach, or referred to as the market data approach. It's one approach that appraisers use commonly for residential properties. but you'll find word associations on the test that are related to the market data approach. In fact, in my exam and insights and strategies video, I talk about the fact you should make, I recommend you make, word association lists. What words are associated with each of these three methods of valuation? With the sales approach or the market data approach, yes, subject property, comparable property, adjusting the comparables, the fact that you never adjust the price of the subject property. Number one, you don't know the price of the subject property. The appraiser is trying to figure that out. But the sales price of a comparable, if it's better or worse, will need to be adjusted to make it more like the subject property. So these are great word associations for the sales approach and the market data approach. The cost approach is the second method of valuation we'll talk about here. It's used for special purpose buildings. Good to be aware of that. I would make a note of that because the test question is going to be, which type of valuation method is best suited for a special purpose building or a unique building, like a church or a library? They'll ask the question that way on the test. You remember from your course materials the general formula for the cost approach. What would it cost to build the building new? Then we have to subtract some depreciation. We'll talk about types of depreciation in just a minute. And then you add back the value of the land. But that's the general formula, but I want to drill down on a couple keywords that you'll need to know for the test. You'll need to know the difference between reproduction and replacement. The owner of the building might say, maybe it's a library or a church. The appraiser will ask the owner, do you want me to calculate in my appraisal the reproduction method or the replacement method? Best way to remember this is make a note. I want to suggest that the reproduction method involves an exact duplicate. Reproduce what's there. Maybe it's the entire building. Maybe it's just part of the building. Maybe in a library, it's a beautiful hand-carved fireplace surround, something like that. If the owner wants the value calculated for the reproduction method, that's going to be very, very, very expensive. Or the owner might say, no, just calculate the replacement method, which is something similar and with similar utility, but not an exact duplicate. So know the difference for your exam between reproduction and replacement. And you should also remember that those two words are associated with the cost approach. And then it says you want to subtract depreciation. Well, we need to talk a little bit more about depreciation. You want to be sure you're aware for the test of the different types of depreciation. 3 different types you'll see on the test regarding the cost approach. So, physical depreciation, that's basically wear and tear. That's all that is, wear and tear. Functional obsolescence is a little more involved. It's something like an outdated floor plan. Maybe you have a 4-bedroom house with 1 bathroom. That's functional obsolescence in today's market. The other key term to remember for depreciation is economic obsolescence. Think of it this way. Economic obsolescence deals with things external to the property. Maybe there's a railroad track that goes by about a block away and rattles dishes off the shelf whenever a train goes by. A common example on the test is in a flight path to the airport. If you have 6 planes landing over the house every day, that's referred to as economic obsolescence. So know those 3 different types and know the differences. Our third type of valuation is the income approach. Obviously, that's laid out and used for properties that produce an income, like an apartment building or a shopping center. The value of those buildings is not the value of the brick and mortar or the replacement cost. The true value in an income producing property is how much income will it produce? The future income, the anticipation of future profits. That's what drives the value of those properties. You'll also have some word associations that you'll need to be aware of for the test. On the slide, you can see there's NOI for net operating income, the cap rate, the value of the property. Those are key words for the income approach. We'll talk about NOI and cap rate in a minute, but be aware they'll ask you about those word associations on the test. An appraiser calculating net operating income is using which method of valuation? That's going to be the income approach. That's how those questions will show up. Let's start with net operating income, the first of those three terms. Net operating income is going to show up on the test this way. They'll ask you to calculate a net operating income. And I should mention, you will have access to a calculator in your test. Typically, that's the case. Sometimes the calculator might be on a drop-down menu on the computer, or some very, very simple basic calculators you'll be allowed to take in. Nothing with any memory. Can't use your phone calculator, clearly. But let's assume for net operating income, they have an example similar to this. They'll give you the numbers, but if you had a 4-unit building, you're getting $2,000 a month for each unit. That would be $24,000 per year for each unit, times 4 units would be a potential gross income of $96,000. Now, you as a landlord don't get to keep all that money, obviously. You have expenses. One of the expenses you'll deduct from your potential gross income is any vacancies or bad debts. We'll use a number of 5%. Put that number in there, 4,800. That gets you a term called your effective gross income. But you still don't get to keep all that money because now you have expenses to operate the building. Operate your fourplex. You have insurance, you have landscaping, you have all of the cost of repairs, all of those. There'll be a number in there, something like $36,000. Maybe it costs you $3,000 a year, $3,000 a month to operate and maintain the entire fourplex. That would be $36,000 a year. So that'll get subtracted from your potential gross income. So now your actual gross income, your net operating income, is going to be $55,200. Here's the testable point. Take a look at the bottom of the slide. In the list of items they'll give you on the test, they will list debt service, your mortgage payment. Let's assume that your mortgage payment on the entire building is $4,000 a month. That would be $48,000 a year. But you don't use that debt service in calculating your net operating income. That's the big testable point. Make sure that you don't include any debt service number with the calculation for your net operating income. But let's just take a look at the example here real quick. How would that work out? If you have a $55,200 net operating income, but you still have to pay $48,000 a year in your debt service, that means how much is left over? In this case, you'd have $7,200 left over. That would be your annual positive cash flow. You still have money left over after you collect your net operating income. On this building, just as a thought process, what if you paid $5,000 a month for your debt service? That means $5,000 a month would equal $60,000 a year, but your net operating income is only a little over $55,000 a year. So you'd have negative cash flow, $4,800 in that case. The key point for the test is no debt service is involved in the calculation for net operating income. So where does your debt service calculation number come in? That's going to be when you try and calculate your cash flow, either positive or negative. So there'll be a couple other simple calculations you'll likely have to do on your national exam, or maybe they'll just ask you to describe the process. But circle formulas will come in very handy, particularly in this In this instance, you all know that if you have a three-part formula, A times B equals C, and you know two of those pieces, you can always solve for the third by either multiplying or dividing the other two. My problem has always been, and maybe for you too, I can never remember when to multiply and when to divide. So that's the beauty of the circle formula. I want you to look at the one here. I've put the one up that is used normally for the income approach. There's three parts to the formula. On the very top, the I is the net operating income. The R on the bottom left is the cap rate. Well, what's the cap rate? The cap rate, short for capitalization rate, but just think, if you want to make this note, it'll be helpful. A cap rate is equal to the rate of return. The rate of return that an investor wants if they buy the building. You're all familiar with a rate of return. If you have a savings account, it's not real exciting and not very big at this moment, but if you have a savings account and you make 2% or 3% a year on your savings, that 2 or 3% rate of return on your savings, you can easily view that as your capitalization rate. Capital is what? Capital is money. So it really discloses how much money you're making with your money. That's what investors look at. If I put X number of dollars in this building, how much will I get back in return? So that's what cap rate is. And the third number is the value. The value, in most cases, for an appraiser is a calculated number. And how is it calculated? Well, you're familiar with circle formulas, I'm sure. If you have a three-part formula and you have one on the top and two on the bottom, you simply cover up the section you're trying to solve for. So if you cover up the V, you can see that if the I is on top and the R is on the bottom, if you have a top number and a bottom number, you divide the top number by the bottom number to get the other missing piece of the puzzle you're trying to solve for. And that's the beauty of the circle formula, because they won't work it straight up like that on the test. They might give you the net operating income and the cap rate, and then you can calculate the value. Or they might give you the cap rate and the value and say, what was the net operating income? Well, with the circle formula, you can easily see when you need to divide and when you need to multiply. Now, I want to do this quick example with you because I want you to be aware of what you're going to see on the test and how it's going to show up. I refer to this circle formula for the income approach. For me, I always think of IRV, the investor, IRV. I on the top, R and V on the bottom from left to right. IRV, IRV, the investor. That just helps me remember it. If you want to make a note in your notebook now, maybe draw that circle formula quick and plug some of these numbers in. It would be a good review. Let's just say for test purposes, they tell you that annual net operating income is $55,200, and they tell you the average cap rate in the area is 8%. By that, it means the appraiser went out and looked at other rental properties to see what the other cap rates are on the other properties. And that way they establish an average cap rate for the neighborhood. So if somebody buys this building, they should also get the average cap rate. So if you know the net operating income is $55,200 and the average cap rate is 8%, how do you calculate the value? Pretty simple. Take a look at the formula. You take net operating income and divide it by the 8%. But as I said before, they're only going to give you two of those numbers. You don't know which two you're going to get. They might give you the value and the cap rate. They might give you the net operating income and the value and ask you to calculate the cap rate. Well, with the circle formula, you'll be able to calculate that very quickly. Here's a quick example of a word association list for valuation. I encourage you to make these word association lists. They're going to help you get more test questions right. I put these together pretty quickly. I want to show you this example, but you have the sales comparison approach or the market data approach, same thing, income approach, and the cost approach. And I've just inserted some of the word associations involved with each one of those approaches. I just want to share this with you because that's how they're going to show up on the test. I've mentioned that before. An appraiser using the cap rate and net operating income to calculate a value is using which approach? An appraiser adjusting comparables and analyzing a subject property is using which approach? That's how you'll see many of the test questions. Know that you're going to see them that way. An appraiser calculating reproduction or replacement cost is using which approach? You get the idea. This is a word association list that you can use for valuation, but all throughout the entire course one that you have to take before you take your exam, word association lists will help you remember many of those topics. We have one more circle formula for you, a little more math, and then we're almost done with valuation. Another term called the gross rent multiplier. When would an appraiser use the gross rent multiplier? Well, frankly, it's used to help estimate the value of residential rental properties, typically 1 to 4 units. Pretty sure you're going to see that as a test question too. On what sort of properties would an appraiser use the gross rent multiplier method? And that's where it's going to show up, residential rentals. Let's talk about that circle formula. If you make a copy of this or make a note, it would be helpful to you. This one is different, obviously, than the income approach. This one is VGR. V is for value, gross rent multiplier on the bottom left, and rent charged on the bottom right. So you have 3 elements here: the value, the gross rent multiplier, and the rent. An appraiser would use this to try and figure out the value or estimate the value of a rental property. So how is the appraiser arriving at these numbers? Well, I'll share this. The one that is a mystery to a lot of people when you start out is the gross rent multiplier. Well, take a look at the formula. We'll talk about this just for a second. How can a gross rent multiplier be calculated? Well, an appraiser would go to existing rental properties in the same neighborhood as his subject property or her subject property. And the appraiser would look at the value and the monthly rent being collected. And the gross rent multiplier is just a hash number, I call it, a way to compare the value and the rent. Just a number to compare the value with the rent. But if an appraiser looks at 7 or 8 properties that have a certain value and then he knows how much rent they're getting, he can calculate for that area or that neighborhood what an average gross rent multiplier is. Then the appraiser would take the next step and say, okay, now I'm going to go to my subject property. I know what they can get for rent, same rent as in the area, and I know what the average gross rent multiplier is. Now I can do the multiplication calculation at the bottom of the circle formula, and the appraiser can come up with what the value for that property is. So that's how an appraiser would use it in the marketplace. Well, here's how you're going to see the gross rent multiplier on your exam. They will give you some numbers. Remember, VGR are the 3 symbols in the gross rent multiplier circle formula. How do I remember that? I'm old enough to remember when we used to have VCRs in our houses. Well, this is close to VCR. It's not VCR, it's VGR, but it helps me remember the sequence of the 3 that are in there. But you'll see a test question something like this. There'll be 2 components you need to solve for the third. A property receives an annual rent of $24,000. And the area gross rent multiplier on an annual basis is 10. Gross rent multiplier on an annual basis for the area is 10. What's the value of the property? Well, you'll multiply the two numbers on the bottom, the gross rent multiplier and the rent, to come up with a value of $240,000. So again, the gross rent multiplier is just a number that establishes that relationship. Has no other use beyond that. But here's my keynote for this slide. Take a look in the middle of the slide. Match the multiplier, monthly or annual. Here's a sample of what you're likely to see, and they always ask the question this way. This question will start out with the annual gross rent multiplier in the area is 10. And this property receives a monthly rent of $2,000. Well, you see the problem? Monthly rent and an annual gross rent multiplier. They will likely give you the gross rent multiplier as an annual number, but then express the rent as a monthly number. So what are you going to need to do? Convert the monthly rent into an annual rent figure. If you don't do that, obviously you won't get the correct answer. So match your multipliers between the GRM and the rent. Okay, we've been talking about how appraisers, when they do appraisals, come up with a value estimate for a property. There are other methods of valuation that will show up on the test. And I want to talk about them just real quick and share with you the distinctions so you get them straight for the test. A comparative market analysis, a CMA, or competitive market analysis, sometimes it's called. That's what real estate licensees do. We as a real estate licensee never do an appraisal unless you have an appraiser's license. We do a CMA. It's very similar to the market data approach or the sales approach that appraisers do. But if you do a market analysis for people, a comparative market analysis, you have to stress, this is a testable point, you have to say that it cannot be used as an appraisal. I didn't appraise your property, I'm giving you a competitive market analysis. But stressing that it is not an appraisal is a very important point that you'll be tested on. Something similar to that called a broker's price opinion, very similar to a CMA. That's all you need to know for the test. It's done by licensees. Maybe the broker does it. Maybe the broker asks you to do a BPO. Sometimes it's a shortened version for used for a bank. A bank might commission a BPO to get a general idea of what a property is worth if they're going to foreclose on it or something. So BPOs and CMAs are very similar. The third type that might just show up on the test in maybe one question is an automated valuation method. Now that's software that would help to estimate the value of many, many properties in a large volume over a city, something like that. That's the automated valuation method. And that concludes our episode on valuation. Take a look at the national exam topic videos here that are available. If you see another topic you'd like to refresh yourself on or brush up on before your exam, please feel free to watch that. Thank you for watching this one. I appreciate your comments you might want to make. If you want to subscribe to my videos here, I'll be happy to keep you updated when I release my career prep videos and my skills prep videos for life after your exam as you get licensed in real estate. If you like the video, certainly please hit the like icon down below. And if you know somebody else taking their exam soon or is in the process of taking their classes before they take their real estate license exam, please feel free to share it with them. Thank you very much. Stay focused, stay positive.